In this video we are going to listen to a presentation given by Kate on what to consider when using interviews as a research tool. There are 3 sections to this presentation, and in each section I'm going to give you a few questions to answer. If you would like to have the questions in front of you before we begin, then print off the PDF file you will find beneath this video. In the first section, Kate introduces interviews, and the 3 questions I would like you to answer are: what are interviews for? What are you hoping to get from the participant? And which type of interview is mostly used in childhood research? Jot down your answers as you listen to the next clip.
Interviews can be used to collect facts. For example, information about people's places of work, their age, where they live, their gender. But such questions are usually no more than opening items preceding the main substance of the interview. The bulk of interview questions seek to elicit information about attitudes and opinions, perspectives and meanings. In fact, the very stuff of childhood, family and education studies. Interviews are also widely used because they are a powerful means of both obtaining information and gaining insights. We use them because they give us an idea of what makes people tick, of the personality and the motivations of the interviewee. Interviews are available in a range of styles. If you've ever been stopped in the high street to be quizzed about, for example, your use of toiletries, you'll know what a closed-ended structured interview feels like. Social scientists and educationalists make similar use of tightly controlled preset interviews, which have been piloted on sample groups to test their efficiency and accuracy before being tried out on larger populations. These structured interviews in their simplest form are sometimes little more than oral questionnaires, used instead of the written form in order to obtain a higher response rate, or with respondents who might not be literate, may be non-verbal, or may not be capable of correctly completing a complex questionnaire, for example, children and vulnerable adults. At the opposite extreme in interview design are completely unstructured conversations between researcher and respondent, where the latter has as much influence over the course of the interview as the former. There is a halfway house, where the researcher designs a set of key questions to be raised before the interview takes place, but builds in considerable flexibility about how and when these issues are raised, and allows for a considerable amount of additional topics to be built in response to the dynamics of conversational exchange. These are known as semi-structured interviews. They are the form most often used in childhood, families and education research.
In this next section, Kate is going to talk about the different types of interview. So I'd like you to consider the following questions. What skills should be demonstrated by the interviewer when conducting interviews? What should an interviewer be careful of doing when using unstructured interviews? When would it be appropriate to use a structured interview? And finally, what is a main benefit of using a semi-structured interview?
So how do you decide on what form of interview to use? A great deal of qualitative material comes from talking with people, whether it be through formal interviews or casual conversations. If interviews are going to tap into the depths of reality of the situation and discover subjects' meanings and understandings, it's essential for the researcher to develop empathy with interviewees and win their confidence, and to be unobtrusive in order not to impose their own influence on the interviewee. The best technique for this is the unstructured interview. Here, the researcher has some general ideas about the topics of the interview. There are no predetermined questions, but the researcher may have an aide-memoire of points that might arise in discussion for use as prompts if necessary. But the hope is that those points will come up in the natural course of the discussion as the interviewee talks. Care is needed, however, to avoid leading questions or suggesting outcomes, and skill is called for in discovering what the interviewee really thinks. The researcher aims to appear natural, not someone with a special role, but one who engages with interviewees on a person-to-person basis. However, it might be that the researcher begins with a more focused study and wishes to know certain things. In these cases, a structured interview might be more appropriate. Here, the researcher decides the structure of the interview and sets out with predetermined questions. This is obviously less naturalistic, and there is clearly not as much scope for the interviewee to generate the agenda. Structured interviews may take the form of standardised, open-ended interviews. The same open-ended questions are asked to all interviewees. It results in faster interviews that can be more easily analysed and compared. Alternately, structured interviews can take the form of closed fixed response interviews. All interviewees are asked the same questions and asked to choose answers from among the same set of alternatives. Sometimes this represents nothing more than an oral questionnaire. For this reason, some researchers use semi-structured interviews. These interviews have some preset questions, but allow much more scope for open-ended answers. Both kinds of interview might be used in the same research. For example, the initial stage of a project might be exploratory and expansive, but once certain issues have been identified, the researcher might use more focused interviews. They are still grounded in the reality of the situation. Fundamentally then, the degree to which the interview is structured, that is, the extent to which the content and order of questions are predetermined, depends on the nature of the research itself and the overall approach to be adopted.
In this next section, Kate gives an introduction to writing interview questions. Here are the questions I would like you to consider when listening to this section. What should you have in mind before you start to develop your interview questions? What is a rationale? And what should you do with a question which doesn't have a good rationale for its use?
When thinking about the questions to be posed in an interview, you should have in mind the overall research questions with which you are concerned. The fundamental question that must then be asked is, what are you trying to find out? Every interview must have a purpose, and every question must have a purpose. You should try writing your own rationale in terms of statements like, I need to know whether or not senior members of staff are more likely to support the moves to introduce appraisal and what reasons they have for the positions they express. I need to find out why junior staff seem opposed. That is, are they misinformed about the nature of the reforms, or are they protecting weaker colleagues from what is seen as scapegoating in an underfunded profession of whom too much is demanded with too little support? This can be developed so as to produce a justification for every question used. For example, I asked this so as to probe the extent to which those of various positions in the hierarchy valued staff consensus and the feeling of shared purpose, with the intention of seeing whether those who were strongly committed to such views were also more or less opposed to staff appraisal. If you can't come up with a good rationale for every question, drop the question.